All right, so ready to dive into another cold case.
Always.
This one's got all the classic true crime elements. We're heading to Tacoma, Washington,
Okay.
back in 1961. August. It was August 31st to be exact,
Uh-huh.
and it was a stormy night. 8-year-old girl, Marie Burr, vanishes from her home.
Vanishes.
Yeah, just gone.
Wow.
And there were all these weird clues left behind, so many questions.
Like what? What kind of clues?
Well, for one, it seems like whoever took her got in and out without a trace.
Impossible entry and exit. That's always a good start for a mystery.
Right, and of course her family was devastated, just plunged into this nightmare.
Of course, yeah.
But here's where it gets even crazier. There's a possible link to Ted Bundy.
No way. Ted Bundy, that's a whole other level.
Yeah, it's a pretty wild theory. So we're going to examine all the evidence, look at different theories, and see if we can untangle this whole thing. What do you think?
I'm in. Where do we even begin with something like this? It's like you said, the perfect crime, right?
Yeah.
Or at least a perfectly unsolved one. The basic facts don't even seem to add up.
You're telling me, okay, let's start with the night Anne-Marie disappeared. She was sharing a room with her little sister who woke up crying.
Yeah.
Kid stuff she had a cast on, and it was itchy.
Ah, yeah.
So Anne-Marie, being a good big sister, walked her back to their parents' room.
Okay.
Parents comforted the little one, sent both girls back to bed. Seems normal enough, right?
Yeah, totally. It's like a scene from any family. Until it isn't, until you realize that's the last time anyone saw her.
It's those everyday moments, right? They become chilling turning points in these cases.
Exactly. It's the normalcy that makes it so creepy.
Yeah. And later that morning, her mom goes to check on the girls and finds Anne-Marie's bed empty.
Oh.
But it's not just that she's gone. There are signs that something really bad happened. The front door was wide open.
The front door?
Yeah. And they always locked it at night, with a chain.
Oh, so someone broke in.
Maybe. But the weird thing is, it was unlocked from the inside.
From the inside?
Yep. And there's more. A window in the living room was open, too. Propped open, like with a piece of red twine.
Almost like an invitation, huh?
Right. And then there's this garden bench. It was usually behind the house, but it was moved under the open window.
Under the window? So they could climb in?
That's what it looks like. And get this, underneath the bench, there was a footprint. Just one.
Wait, a footprint? If it was stormy, wouldn't it have washed away?
That's what makes it so strange, right? It's like a ghost was there. It was a stormy night, so a lot of evidence could have been washed away, but that footprint remained. It's like a ghostly reminder that someone was definitely there.
Yeah, it's like whoever did this was trying to stage a break-in, but messed up on that one detail.
Like, was it intentional, to throw off the police? Or was it just a careless mistake?
It makes you wonder, what were they thinking?
Right, like trying to get inside the mind of, I don't know, a phantom.
Exactly, intentional misdirection. Or just a slip-up that tells us something about them, about how they were feeling that night.
It's a question that has bothered investigators for years.
Yeah, I bet. And on top of all that, some of her stuff was missing too. Not just, anything, but specific things.
Like what?
Her nightgown, light blue one, a necklace, it had 2 religious medallions on it, and a silver bracelet engraved with her name, address, and phone number.
Why take those things? Why not just take her? It just makes the whole thing even more bizarre.
It's like, did they want to make it harder to identify her? Or was there some other reason? Something, I don't know, more symbolic?
So many questions. It adds another layer to this already strange puzzle.
Totally. Okay, so we've got a missing girl, a staged break-in, and missing personal items. What did the police do?
Well, with all that, they figured it had to be a kidnapping.
Yeah.
And because of how the person got in and out so easily, they thought it must have been someone she knew.
Someone she'd trust enough to go with. Or someone who could overpower her without making a sound.
Makes sense.
So they started looking at people close to home. Did they find anything?
They launched a huge search, went door to door, talked to family, friends, neighbors, anyone who might have seen something, heard something.
Did they find any leads?
Nothing. It's like she vanished into thin air.
Man, that's got to be so frustrating, especially for her family.
You can't even imagine. And it's even more frustrating because the case basically went cold after that.
So that was it. No more leads, no more clues.
Well, there were a few twists and turns. Like, there was a ransom note at one point.
Really? So there's hope.
Yeah, but it turned out to be a hoax.
Oh, that's awful. Can you imagine the family's hope and then boom, it's crushed?
It's a terrible thing to do. And they never figured out who sent it. Just another loose end.
Man, this is a mess. What else happened?
Well, There was this teenage neighbor who lived nearby. He failed a lie detector test, but then passed the second one.
So he was suspicious.
The police were definitely wary of him, but they didn't have enough to go on.
It's like even when you have something that seems objective, like a lie detector, it can be so unreliable, especially in a situation as emotional as this.
So, yeah, a case full of mystery, no clear suspect, and a trail that ran cold. But that's not where the story ends.
There's more.
Oh, yeah. Remember how I mentioned Ted Bundy?
Yeah. This is where it gets creepy, right?
You could say that. You have this little girl who disappears under mysterious circumstances, and then you have this future serial killer who already had some disturbing behavior living just a few blocks away.
It's almost too perfect, like it's straight out of a movie.
Right. It feels like it has to be more than just coincidence, but is it?
So was Bundy really involved?
Well, that's what we're going to try to figure out. The thing is, at the time, Bundy was just a teenager.
Uh-huh.
But even then, he was already sneaking around neighborhoods, breaking into houses. We know that from his confessions later on.
So there's a pattern there, something the investigators couldn't ignore.
Exactly. And it's a disturbing one, right? You have this escalation of criminal activity, and it kind of fits with Anne-Marie's disappearance.
Makes you wonder if this was just the beginning for Bundy.
But did he ever admit to doing anything to Anne-Marie?
Actually, he denied it. Even when he was confessing to all those other horrible things he did. He even wrote a letter to Anne-Marie's mother right before he was executed, saying he didn't know anything about what happened to her.
Wow. Can you imagine getting that letter? After all those years, being so close to maybe getting an answer, and then nothing.
Must have been devastating for her. Talk about adding insult to injury.
Seriously. But why wouldn't he confess to this one too, if he was already admitting to so much else?
Well, Bundy was a master manipulator. I mean, the guy was known for being charismatic and deceptive. Some people think those denials were just another part of his sick game.
Like a way to keep some part of his past hidden.
A secret he could take to the grave.
So even in his denial, there's this lingering doubt. It's like he wanted to maintain that control, even from death row.
It's the kind of detail that would keep people obsessed with this case.
Yeah, for sure. But besides the behavioral patterns and him living nearby, is there any actual proof that he was involved? Like any hard evidence?
Not really. No DNA, no fingerprints, no witnesses who saw him at the house that night.
So it all comes down to circumstance and a pattern that might fit.
That's frustrating, right? But there are a few other things that make people suspicious. Bundy said that he started drinking when he was a teenager, and that it played a part in his later crimes. So maybe those dark urges started earlier than he admitted.
And since we know he was already prowling around, breaking into homes.
It's possible that those crimes escalated, and maybe Anne-Marie was an early victim, one that no one knew about.
A terrifying thought. But it's a pattern that happens a lot in these true crime cases.
Definitely. Bob Keppel, the investigator who spent years studying Bundy, he believed there was a specific pattern to Bundy's crimes. He said it started with peeping, then escalated to break-ins, and then finally, abduction and murder.
So if that's true, then Anne-Marie's disappearance fits right into that timeline. It makes a chilling kind of sense. But hold on. Didn't you say earlier that Bundy's family had moved to another part of Tacoma by 1961?
You're right, I did.
So wouldn't that make it harder for him to have been involved? I mean, especially on a stormy night, for a teenager who probably didn't have a car, that's a long way to go.
Yeah, that does cast some doubt on his involvement.
It seems less likely, but I guess not totally impossible.
And that's the problem with the Bundy theory. It's compelling, and his behavior fits, but we don't have that concrete proof. No physical evidence, no confession, and now this issue with his family having moved.
So we're left with this creepy possibility, but ultimately we're still in the dark. It's like one of those mysteries that leaves you hanging, wanting more answers.
It is. And unfortunately, real life doesn't always give us neat and tidy endings.
It's so true. The case is stuck in this frustrating place. We have this theory looming over everything, but without proof, we just can't say for sure if Bundy was responsible for Anne-Marie's disappearance. It's like a puzzle with missing pieces. And those missing pieces could be the key to finally understanding what happened that night.
Exactly. And for the investigators, for Anne-Marie's family, that has to be incredibly frustrating. I mean, they've lived with this unanswered question for decades. Did Bundy take the truth to his grave?
Maybe. But even though Bundy is gone, the investigation into Anne-Marie's disappearance is still officially open.
So there's still hope.
There's always a chance that some new evidence will turn up or that someone who knows something will finally come forward.
That's good to hear. There's at least a sliver of hope. But what if the Bundy theory is a dead end? What about those other suspects, like the neighbor who failed that lie detector test? Was there anything else suspicious about him?
They never found enough evidence to really build a case against him. But think about it. With all the advances in technology, they could re-examine some of that old evidence. Maybe they could find something new.
It's amazing how technology can crack these cold cases, even after so long. It's like those true crime documentaries where they use DNA and facial recognition to solve cases that have been cold for
They
years.
give you hope that even if justice is delayed, it might still come eventually.
I agree. And with a case as strange as this one, we have to hold on to that hope. The twists, the false leads, the shadow of Ted Bundy. It's like a real-life mystery novel.
Just waiting for the final chapter.
Exactly. So we've looked at the disappearance, the investigation, the possible Bundy connection, and the frustrating lack of answers. But what about the impact this has had on people, on the community, on Anne Marie's family? I think we need to go beyond the investigation and talk about the human side of the story.
I agree. That's where we'll pick up in the next part of our deep dive.
Welcome back. So before the break, we were just getting into the whole Ted Bundy angle.
Right, like could he really have been involved in Anne Marie's disappearance? It's such a disturbing thought, almost too creepy to even consider, but we have to, right? I mean, he was living so close by at the time.
I know it's like something out of a true crime documentary, right?
Yeah.
You have this young girl who vanishes, all these strange clues left behind, and then you have this future serial killer just down the street.
It feels like it's got to be more than just a coincidence. But is there anything more to it than just a creepy feeling?
Well, that's what makes this case so fascinating and so frustrating. Remember, at the time, Bundy was just a teenager. But even then, he was already exhibiting some pretty disturbing behavior. He admitted later on that he was sneaking around neighborhoods, breaking into houses, and this was all around the same age he would have been when Anne Marie disappeared.
So we're talking about a pattern of behavior, an escalation of criminal activity.
Exactly. And it's a pattern that fits with what we know about Bundy's later crimes.
Like maybe this was just the beginning for him. Maybe Anne Marie was an early victim, one that never got reported.
It's a chilling thought, and it's something that investigators have considered very seriously over the years. But did he ever actually admit to having anything to do with Anne Marie's disappearance?
That's what I'm wondering. Like if he confessed to all those other awful things, why not this one too?
He didn't. Even when he was on death row, confessing to all those other murders, he denied having anything to do with Anne Marie. He even wrote a letter to her mother right before his execution.
What? He wrote to her mother.
Yeah, and in the letter, he insisted that he didn't know what happened to Anne Marie.
Wow. Can you imagine getting that letter after all those years of not knowing and then to get that? It's almost cruel.
It's heartbreaking. It must have been incredibly difficult for her mother to process, like so close to maybe getting some answers, and then nothing.
Yeah, to have that hope dashed like that. But it still doesn't explain why he wouldn't confess to this one too, if he was already admitting to so much else.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Some people believe his denials were all part of his game.
Like he wanted to keep some part of himself hidden, even from the authorities.
Exactly. Like even in his denial, he was still controlling the narrative.
That's messed up. But okay, even if his behavior was suspicious, and even if he was lying about not being involved, is there any real proof, any evidence that connects him to Anne Marie's disappearance?
That's the problem. There's no physical evidence, no DNA, no fingerprints, no witnesses who saw him at the house that night.
So all we have is this theory, this pattern of behavior that seems to fit, and the fact that he was living nearby.
Right. It's all circumstantial. And to make things even more complicated, remember, Bundy's family had moved to a different part of Tacoma by 1961.
Oh, yeah, you mentioned that earlier. So wouldn't that make it harder for him to be involved?
It would. He would have had to travel a significant distance to get to the Burrs' house. And we're talking about a teenager, probably without a car, on a stormy night.
Yeah, that doesn't seem very likely.
It casts some doubt on his involvement, for sure.
But it's not impossible, right?
Right. And that's the frustrating thing about the Bundy theory. It's so compelling, and there are so many things that line up, but we just don't have the concrete evidence to prove it.
So it's like one of those true crime mysteries where you're left with more questions than answers?
Exactly. And the not knowing, it's got to be incredibly difficult for everyone involved, especially Anne Marie's family. I mean, they've lived with this for decades, not knowing what happened to their little girl.
And did Bundy take the truth to his grave? I mean, is there any hope that this will ever be solved?
Well, the case is still officially open. Even though Bundy never confessed, and even though it's been so many years, there's always a chance that new evidence could surface. Or maybe someone who knows something will finally come forward.
It's like that saying, justice delayed is not justice denied.
Exactly. And even if the Bundy theory turns out to be a dead end, there are other angles to explore. Remember the teenage neighbor who failed that lie detector test? Maybe with advancements in technology, they could re-examine some of the old evidence.
Yeah, that's true. They do that all the time on those true crime shows. They use new technology to solve cases that have been cold for years.
Mhm.
It's amazing what they can do with DNA and facial recognition these days.
It really is. And it gives you hope, right? That even after all this time, justice is still possible.
Absolutely. So we've got this baffling mystery, a possible connection to one of America's most notorious serial killers. But still, no real answers.
And it's cases like this one that remind us why we need to keep investigating, why we can't let these victims be forgotten. Even after all these years, Anne Marie's story deserves to be told, and her family deserves answers.
I agree, but I think it's important to remember that this isn't just a story. This is a real life that was tragically cut short, and it's had a lasting impact on so many people, not just Anne Marie's family, but the entire community.
You're right. The ripple effects of a case like this are huge. It changes the way people think about their own safety, about their community, and it forces them to confront the reality that even in seemingly ordinary places, bad things can happen.
It's a reminder that we can't take our safety for granted, and that even though it's been decades since Anne Marie disappeared, her story is still relevant today. So where do we go from here? I mean, we've talked about the investigation, the possible Bundy connection, but what about the human cost of this case?
That's a really important question, and I think it's one that we need to explore more deeply. In the next part of our deep dive, we'll shift gears a bit and talk about the impact this case has had on Anne Marie's family and on the community as a whole.
Welcome back. So we've spent a lot of time going over the details of Anne Marie's disappearance, the investigation, that possible link to Ted Bundy, but we still don't have any real answers, do we?
Nope. And it's cases like this that are the hardest, right? You have all these clues, these theories, but nothing concrete.
It's true. But you know what I keep thinking about? The human side of all this.
Yeah, that's important. We can't forget that behind every cold case, there are real people who are hurting.
Exactly. Like Anne Marie's parents. They went to their graves never knowing what happened to their daughter.
It's tragic. And it's not just the parents, right? What about her siblings? They grew up without their sister, always wondering, always hoping for answers.
And that not knowing, that lack of closure, it has to be just devastating.
Absolutely. It affects everyone, the family, the friends, even the whole community.
That's what I find so interesting about these true crime stories. They always focus on the victims, the perpetrators, but they don't always show how these events affect the people who live in those places, in those neighborhoods.
That's a good point. Cases like this, they shatter that sense of security we all have, that belief that these things happen somewhere else, not in our own backyards.
It's like it could happen to anyone, anywhere,
Yeah.
right? And it makes you question everything.
Exactly. Like, who can you trust? It makes you look at your neighbors differently.
So we have this mystery, this possible connection to Ted Bundy, but ultimately the biggest impact is on the people who are left behind.
And that's what we have to remember, right? It's not just a story, it's a real tragedy that continues to affect people's lives.
And that brings me to my last question for you. What can we learn from all of this? What's the takeaway beyond the mystery itself?
I think it's a reminder that we need to keep investigating these cold cases. Technology is always advancing, new evidence can surface, and sometimes, even after decades, breakthroughs can happen. We can't let these victims be forgotten.
Justice delayed is not justice denied.
Right, and it's also a reminder of the power of memory. Keeping Anne Marie's story alive, sharing her photos, it keeps the hope for justice alive. Not just for her, but for all the other missing children out there.
It's a powerful reminder that these are not just stories, they're real lives, real families who are still hurting.
Absolutely. And there are organizations out there, like the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, that are working tirelessly to help those families find answers.
We'll be sure to include their information in the show notes for anyone who wants to learn more or get involved. So as we come to the end of our deep dive, we're left with these unanswered questions. What happened to Anne Marie Burr? Was Ted Bundy involved? Will this case ever be solved?
We may never know for sure, but we can remember Anne Marie. We can keep her story alive, and we can never stop hoping that someday her family will finally get the closure they deserve.
That's a good place to leave it. Thank you for joining us for another deep dive. And to all our listeners out there, keep Anne Marie and all the other missing children in your thoughts. And never give up hope that someday justice will prevail. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay safe.